The first white man who came to the country went up to an Indian's wigwam, in front of which there stood a bench. The white man took a seat on it beside the Indian, who then moved a little farther off to give him plenty of room. The white man then took the place which he had left. This continued until the Indian had to leave the bench, there being no room left for him. A bit on the nose, but remarkably prescient. Hi, my name is Ian, and today we are talking about Edward Jack's Maliseet Legends. That's the only title it goes by. I choose this reading because despite the fact that it is uncomfortable, despite the fact that it is of its time, and of its time is a nice little excuse that we can have to justify the infelicities if we want to be incredibly slant in how we describe it. How we excuse the past. It's a product of its time. It's good to read the products of their time, however. And so as we read this is a collection, as the title might suggest, of legends, something that goes unexplored, and I'll talk about that in a second, among the Maliseet people. The Maliseet are First Nations of basically Maine and Western New Brunswick. They are essentially cousins of the Mi'kmaq, who are also in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland and Labrador. Not as far as Labrador, basically the island of Newfoundland. And so the New Brunswick is the ancestral territory of the Maliseet. This article is interesting for me personally in many ways because I went to university at St. Thomas in Fredericton, and so all these local references are intriguing. But this is a product. I'm about to say it. I'm about to give the classic excuse. But it's not as an excuse. This is a product of its time. This is from 1895. This is from the Journal of American Folklore, which was only started in 1888. So this is a fairly early contribution to the journal. And it is typical of its historical moment. Jack seems to have been it's just a government crown lands surveyor. If one looks at his other works, they all tend to be public speeches about crown lands. And he suggests as much. If you're reading through the text, he talks about a similar experience he had in Ontario, or a similar tale, the narrative he encountered among the First Nations there, when he was there inspecting the lands because he had been told it would be a good place to visit. So basically he works for the Forestry Service, and he must have encountered these in his moments, in his past. And he's clearly well educated, but not necessarily in the means of folklore. So at best, it's this gentleman scholar who has come across, through his more serious work, he has encountered First Nations people and has decided to, out of some kind of his own good graces, out of his intellectual curiosity, out of his desire to help preserve, whatever his impulses were, to make these available to an interested public, an interested and learned public, even if the disciplinary understandings of folklore were still in the very, very early process of being worked out. So it's collectania. It's a bunch of stories that are very little context is given, very little background is given, and but it's one of the very first things that has been called folklore for Atlantic Canada. It's one of the very first things that was collected and published and framed as folklore. So it's an interesting and an important article to at least grapple with. And perhaps, again, article is not the the appropriate word, but maybe it's a semantic difference. But it's a good reading to get in touch with. The first thing is we can think about legend. And legend is one of my areas of research. But the very title, Maliseet Legends. So what is a legend for him at this particular time? And for the most part, legend, as it was thought of, it wasn't theorized. It was like many of our much terminology, it is sort of seen as self-evident. And it's only when we actually dig deep and realize, oh, okay, well, it actually means different things in different contexts. Maybe not every group understands its narratives in the same categories as Western Europeans do. All of this was yet to be unpacked. But clearly he is in the camp of legends being those narratives that are believed by these people, but clearly not believed by me. It's what the folklorist identifies as a belief narrative of them. Something that is operative, something that is present. Contemporary folklorists would not understand legend that way. They still has that aspect of belief to it. But more than anything, it is belief as a content, but belief is not necessarily an inherent orientation that the teller necessarily has. So the narrative, the belief can be something that is being negotiated through that narrative. So if you think about contemporary legend and aspects of how legend is communicated, sometimes you might hear legend, let's just go old school, alligators in the sewers, and you might believe it. Another time, you might not believe it. And maybe you don't believe it because you've heard it so many times. It's like, oh, wait a second, this isn't an actual account. This is a motif that is being spread. But you also might say, no, that didn't happen. But I can see why people would think that it happens. And all of a sudden, you are into this process of trying to unpack belief and unpack the worldview in which stories like this can circulate. So if you think about legends having to do with oriented towards ethnic groups in a community, or oriented towards occupations or gender or you might not, you personally, not you the folklorist, you the member of the folk, might not actually believe them, but understand what gives that narrative traction. So that's a brief tangent about legend. He's not working in that subtlety. He's basically, it's like, these people believe these things. And so legend becomes a sort of awkward category that way. So he seems to be collecting something that the contemporary folklorists would understand as legend. They might also understand them as myth, sacred stories, incredibly important narratives that have to do with how people came into being. Much of these involve Glooskap, the first man, fundamentally. This character, and I don't want to undermine Glooskap by calling him a character, but within both Mi'kmaq and Maliseet cosmology, sort of the founding hero. It's a difficult concept. I don't think I'm using the words appropriately, but sometimes presented as a giant, sometimes presented as just sort of a first among equals, ability to have certain powers of shaping the geography, and sort of an explanatory feature, not only for how the landscape gets shaped, but also for how systems of governance and systems of order can get set up. So, and so an important figure. And myth, again, just using our folklorist definitions, myth is not a falsehood. Myth is a founding narrative, a narrative that is, again, using this issue of belief, that is, even if it's only believed within the context of sort of sacred moments, and we can sort of turn around and in our other modes of life, pick away at that narrative. Think about like the Genesis myth for Christianity and Judaism and Islam. We might go, oh, okay, scientifically, no, but within our houses of worship, if we practice in that way, we wholeheartedly believe that narrative, and it holds sort of symbolic, more than symbolic resonance. It has to have happened. It's narratives that, had these events not happened, we would fundamentally not be here. So you don't mess with them. You don't dismiss them easily. And because they have a role of orientation, they inform the group. Whether or not the group still holds them as a description of actual ontological events, or whether it is just so symbolically laden that you cannot disentangle them, you just don't mess with them. But they are not falsehoods. Myth, the contemporary idea of myth, should not be confused with the common sense understanding of myth as a mere falsehood, or worse, a lie. So sometimes he's dealing with legend, sometimes he might be dealing with myth, sometimes he might be dealing with tale. Narratives that have to do with, that are not purported to be historically true, are not aiming at being historically true. They are understood as fiction. And to question their veracities is to miss the point of why they are being told. They're not necessarily being told merely as entertainment, but they can be framed the way that we can frame fiction, as like life, but not necessarily a report of history, and therefore can allow for certain fantastic elements that we don't need to disentangle. We don't need to argue for or against. They just are. But we don't know. We don't know how we should frame these, because Jack was not interested in context. Either he was just reporting, or he thought that the narratives would more or less speak for themselves of how they were meant to be interpreted. And his source is just given as Gabe. I cannot tell whether it's pronounced Gabe or Gabe. And if you read the very last footnote, that's the only description that you ever get of Gabe. Let me see. Gabe I have known for many years. He is honorable in all his dealings, and I have found that the legends which he related to me include a number known of the Chippeways of Odana on the head of Lake Superior, visited by me when engaged in exploring timberlands in that region. That's the hint I gave earlier about how he had come across others. But that's all we know about the informant Gabe from Jack. So that's all we know well into the 21st century, reading this article, and that's all that the people reading the article in 1895 would have known. Gabe has been actually studied. There's a report that the New Brunswick Museum put out giving his history. So he was born in 1811 and he died in 1901. So in his 90th year, if not actually past 90. He's from the St. Mary's First Nation. He was prominent as a guide, a hunter, and cultural broker. And let's see, Purley, who wrote the report, Gabe's knowledge of, please forgive me if I don't pronounce this correctly, Wolastoqey customs and traditions, his superior woodsmanship, and his winning personality made him a man of some repute amongst military officers, visiting dignitaries, and others who regularly sought his services. And he basically became sort of a cultural ambassador. He traveled internationally for Wolastoqey culture. And he was never elected chief, but he was recognized as an emissary and statesman. So he was a real person. He was, at the very least, he deserved perhaps more than 2 sentences, or actually a sentence and a half in a footnote. Because the contemporary collector would at the very least pay some attention. It wouldn't simply be it wouldn't have turned into some kind of biography of Gabe, but it would, at the very least, it would try and put it into some kind of context, even more than simply, he is an honorable man, you can trust me. His description is entirely about, Jack's description of Gabe is entirely about Jack. Trust me. And in a way, oddly, it's this sort of the ultimate friend of a friend. So, and how would recording have taken place? The sound recording did exist as a technology in 1895, but Jack did not have one. Very few people had one. I think it was only in the 1890s when the very, very first ethnographic recordings were available, were done in the United States. It was a rarity. There were very few recording, at least in the field, recordings in Atlantic Canada for decades. Helen Creighton didn't have a recording equipment until the 1940s. There was no recording equipment brought into Cape Breton until McEdward Leach did his trip in 1949, and no recording done in the field. There were radio stations. There was access to recording equipment. It was a contemporary place, but not in terms of for ethnographic field recordings. It didn't happen in Newfoundland until 1950, until after Confederation. So Jack is basically transcribing. He is transcribing, and we don't know his skills as a transcriptionist. And he is, and so as you're reading them, it's interesting to sort of see what he might have had. That you might notice on page 194, there's that thing where the manuscript fails, and there's no indication what that means. And there's also, of course, about how the stories are presented, because he is now transcribing and transliterating, as it were, the oral speech patterns of Gabe into the text, into this strange medium that is the academic article, which is in paragraph form, but very short sentences, very and it is not. I have read worse, but it is not necessarily much different from the stylized prose of American and Canadian pulp authors who introduced this idea of how First Nations people spoke, the short sentences and so on, the overabundance of pronouns, the absence of much in the way of adverbs and adjectives. So we don't know how this was told. Is he creating or recreating how Gabe spoke, or is he recreating the story, but in a way that will sort of be resonant and with the audience that he is communicating these stories to? And when I say he, I'm talking about Jack in this moment. And we don't know. And the fact that we don't know, the fact that we have this man who collected these things that are meant to speak for themselves, is one of the issues that we grapple with when we talk about the history of folklore study in everywhere, not simply in Atlantic Canada, and among every people, not simply among the First Nations, but given how, given the legacy of not valuing First Nations contributions until very recently. It's a painful look back at these sort of legacies. So other than that, there's not much to tell. There are some interesting narratives. There's two versions, seemingly parallel versions. The second one is slightly more expanded, of Glooscap narratives of the first man. There are a couple of etiological legends. An etiological legend is basically how typically a feature of landscape came to be. They're origin legends, and so he talks about the forming of the Tobic rocks. Talks about why the squirrel isn't a lion size. That's kind of awesome. And so, as much as we wish the stories he collected were presented in a better way, we still can get something fun and something intriguing and something dynamic from the stories. The fact that there are beliefs that are present, and occasionally we get sort of these insights into not simply this repertoire of narratives that Gabe was able to share, but Gabe's own personal take on them. Like there's this one point where he's throwing, they're passing the rocks, and that is, as a child, he also threw figs of tobacco as a sort of a way of assuring a calm voyage. So at least we get some insight into active belief practice. We don't know how old that active belief practice is, but in 1895, someone affirmed it as useful. Therefore, there's a certain amount of use that we can get from it. And also, there's like little elements that seem to reflect local concerns. The use of the word council. Council appears so often, and the form of governance that was being that was active as it is today. It was active and forming in 1895 was at the very least the same word for the form of governance that was dates back to Glooskap's time. So this sense of continuity is present within the narrative, and at least the reaffirmation that there is a sense that there is continuity is important. And in as much as there is some interesting points there, some things to ponder despite the sloppy collecting methods, there's some stray observations that we might need to pick. This decontextualized sentences. For example, there's a one that says it's in one of the Glooskap stories. It's on page 196. "Nephew, I want to sleep with you once more, the same as I did when you were a boy." That, I think, could do with an explanatory comma of some description. But there's also some interesting motifs that we can pick out. And motifs are those elements that, in folk literature circles, a motif is basically something that is sort of a resonant feature, something that strikes one as not odd, not peculiar, but as stylized in some way. We can think of, in folk lit, we can think of things like stepsisters, things like apples or poisoned apples, things like a particular sort of complicated tests that we can go through. And you can look at the motif index for more information on that. But there are motifs within here. For example, like the motif of the rival brothers that eventually end in fratricide. The idea of some kind of marriage deception. The importance of sevens, how seven is often used throughout. And also, of course, the importance of the grandmother. The grandmother is as a sort of sacred figure within an endemic, not simply of wisdom, but like the growth of maternal wisdom, or the font of maternal wisdom that is important in both Mi'kmaq and Maliseet culture. The short stories that he includes are interesting. They're from sources that aren't necessarily Gabe. They're from written accounts, and you can tell that they are different because he has decided to present them in a much, you can say either more or less, but differently stylized form of English. They are in fuller sentences. They have sort of different clarifications on who the pronoun refers to at any given moment, and so on. Again, it's interesting to see how the belief practices are present. There's some interesting folk medicine in terms of the use of calamus as basically an herbal tea to help with indigestion, and that wonderful. Is it half oral history? Is it half blazon populaire? Is it half prank? I don't know, but the Mohawks on the warpath, which is kind of a fascinating story. So I was talking about this with some friends today, and one of the things that's sometimes complicated about folklore study is that we can read the stuff, and the stuff is meant to speak for itself. We were actually sort of bemoaning how when we're associated with like departments of English, that English students are often just given a whole bunch of novels or things, and it's like, now analyze them. And folklorists typically, we just sort of give analysis of things, and most of the readings that we give are here's this thing and here's our big analysis of it. So these are early examples where it's just stuff, and it's stuff without analysis. It's interesting. It's useful. It's partially useful because we have to make so much conjecture about what the narrative might actually have been. We don't know precisely how much editorial gloss he decided that he should, or he could, or he ought to put on it. So we don't really know what Gabe's original narrative was, even if we wholeheartedly believe that Jack is, as far as he is concerned, faithfully recounting Gabe. But we don't know these questions. And we can interrogate them so far. And we can hide behind that product of its time partially. It's like, well, maybe this was the best that Edward Jack, untrained gentleman folklorist, could do, and it is better than not having the stories. Perhaps you can reach that conclusion. It's enshrined in the language of its time. Of course, the simply using the word Indian throughout, which it's still it rings strange to my ears when I go down to the States, and Indian is still the term of art for American First Nations, and so like, really? Okay, really? But that term has more or less been erased from Canadian discourse. But again, we're stuck with that product of its time. It's a hard reading in many ways because it's pandering. It's someone has decided, irrespective of whoever their sources or collaborators might be, someone has decided to speak for and speak of these people, eliminating the original artistry or at least reducing the original artistry and the original ownership of these narratives to just the occasional footnote. And so it is, again, an example of the colonizers speaking for the colonized and getting all the status for speaking for the colonized. And then, his community going, oh, good job, Edward. But that's the legacy that we dig ourselves out from. That's what we're trying to deal with. So this has been Ian, your best friend, discussing the awkward, the sometimes painful, and the somewhat illuminating Edward Jack and his 1895 article on Maliseet Legends. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well and take care.